Hello, my name's Clay Robinson. I will be giving a presentation on sustainable agriculture as a way to take back the future. And this is for FIS 201, Innovation in Society. So the first question is, who are the stakeholders? First, we got to identify who is important in this conversation and whose concerns need to be addressed in kind of taking back this future. So obviously, first in agriculture, you have your farmers. They produce products for consumers. However, they have the largest impact on the environment through human interference of the natural ecosystem. For example, you have pesticide usage, which leads to contamination issues. Current tilling practices lead to barren land, releases more carbon into the air, kind of increases emissions that way. But that's not to say that they don't supply the world's food. And so it's a very necessary, very vital component of life. And especially here in Arizona, they are the largest share of water consumption. And I will get into a little more detail of that later. Our second stakeholder are local governments, municipalities, the way that the agriculture industry interacts with policy and regulation, the way that local governments and farmers work with advocacy organizations who operate in these municipalities, these governments, as well as these governments are responsible for things like water infrastructure and assigning water rights to certain groups and demographics. Finally, you have your consumers, us. We are affected by the environmental impact of farming, increased carbon emissions, poor air quality, reduced water supply. We have to work within these constraints. These lead to health risks associated with commercial farming practices, such as the toxic spillage, the runoff of pesticides, gets in the water supply and things like that. So why Arizona? We have this big issue. We're going to bring it down here. Number one, the agriculture industry here is responsible for 74% of water consumption. That's a significant amount. It's said that 6% of overall carbon emissions can be reduced through climate solutions involving agriculture. And this state, there are many cost-effective strategies that can be implemented here. And there's really a moment of friendly policy intervention, this kind of environment that we're kind of ready for this change. And so I think there's a real opportunity here. Like I said, agriculture is responsible for the largest share of water consumption. And there's always been a threat of drought, especially recently. It's something that needs to be addressed soon. Arizona farms produce vital crops like alfalfa, iceberg lettuce, cotton, and citrus. There's this tension between rural and urban interests because you want to balance those interests because urban communities deserve a right to clean, accessible water supply. And so how do we work with farmers with that? Increased land usage, toxic spillage, and carbon emissions is the way that agriculture industry impacts the local environment. And how is the Arizona legislature, specifically here, and advocacy groups in the state poised to act incrementally to address this growing issue? And in every kind of advocacy group has a different approach. So why does agriculture need innovation? Well, we need to decrease land usage. Barren land releases carbon emissions. It's simple as that. Eliminate toxic chemicals, pesticides runoff, and poisons the water supply. So how do we reduce our reliance on pesticides while still maintaining the quality of the produce? Carbon sequestration, there is potential to reduce carbon emissions naturally by better soil management, things like that. We'll get into something like that later. Reduce water consumption, inefficient irrigation, waste water. And I think that's the biggest issue here, water. I've said it many times already in this presentation. And we need to improve soil conditions. We need to reduce tilling, change our tilling practices, balance nitrogen levels, among other key nutrients in soil. Because we're not just concerned about the health of the plant, we're concerned about the health of the soil, the ecosystem as a whole. You can't really isolate the parts. So what's the solution? For water, drip irrigation is the future. And I think not just the future, will play a big part in water conservation, especially in states like Arizona and more broadly the West, as the drought continues to loom overhead. So what is drip irrigation? Drip irrigation delivers water and nutrients directly to a plant's root zones. And the right amounts at the right time. And so, there can be a lot of programming involved in these kind of systems that can really target these plants in a very efficient way. As a result, this reduces water consumption and produces higher crop yields. It's kind of a win-win. Essentially, what happens is these pipes called drip lines are placed at the base of each plant, and they emit drops of water over a certain period of time. And another thing, it's consistent and uniform application. More traditional irrigation methods are like flooding the plain. That's not really consistent, wastes a lot of water. And so this is kind of the smarter way of irrigating. So how do we generate buy-in into this specific technology? First, there's the policy route. Allocate funding to remove the financial costs. Currently, drip irrigation is a really expensive technology. So now, how do we allocate funding for that? But also, how do we encourage innovation of these current technologies to reduce barriers of entries? So we want to reduce costs while also maintaining the integrity of that technology. And how do we incentivize not only like innovators in this space, but also farmers through tax exemptions, competitive grants? Can we certify farms saying, these farms are committed to water, reducing their water consumption? They get like a green label, something like that, something that they can be proud of. Also, this is something that comes from one of our modules, is the idea of indigenous knowledge. In one of our previous class sessions or modules, we were talking about the continent of Africa and how using that indigenous knowledge will be better for innovation in that space. And I think the same thing applies here. So we have to utilize knowledge from farmers and local residents to kind of understand the issues in these different spaces. Community knowledge should inform both policy and innovation. So not only should it inform the Arizona legislature, it's to inform the private companies working on these innovations. And this is kind of the bottom-up approach. We are diffusing the knowledge from the communities being impacted all the way up to the Arizona legislature, the companies. And finally, education. Farmers, key stakeholders, advocates need adequate education. They need to understand what drip irrigation is, how it works, kind of the same way that I explained in the last slide to everyone watching this. This kind of removes the natural barriers that prop up between innovators, producers, and consumers. And so how do we go from asymmetric knowledge to symmetric knowledge? So where do I fit in? First of all, just being involved in a number of organizations advocating for these kind of policies. I'm already doing some work with the American Conservation Coalition here in the state to kind of advocate for common sense climate solutions, one of which is, preserving a water supply, ensuring our water future in Arizona. And then it's also working with organizations like the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality, kind of the state's agency that works on issues like this, and kind of advocating in their space, saying this is what we need to do, these are some of the things we can implement, and partnering with organizations like the Arizona Farm Bureau, who represent the farmers and have expressed interest in these kind of environmental solutions as kind of the future of farming. And so that's kind of where I personally fit in. It's actually I'm doing an event with ACC and the Arizona Farm Bureau. In about 2 months, we're going to visit a farm who are implementing some of these practices. That they have drip irrigation, laser leveling, and are 100% carbon neutral. And so we're super excited for that. It's sort of that advocacy sphere that where this innovation will take place and how we take back the future. So how long will this take? Obviously, we need a timeline. Well, immediately we can implement crop rotations, adjust tilling methods, use cover crops. These are some of the ways that we can reduce water consumption before we adopt drip irrigation. These practices are not hard to implement, just require a little research and a little understanding of the farm that you are targeting. In 4 to 6 months, install drip irrigation technologies and reduce reliance on flood irrigation models. That's a model I explained a little bit earlier, but it's where you flood the plain, super inefficient. And so just getting these technologies in the farms. In 1 to 3 years, how do we incentivize farms or reward farms for adopting these practices? You can adopt tax exemptions. You can offer competitive grants to kind of spur innovation in this sphere, offer certification programs, kind of offering farms like, hey, thank you for adopting drip irrigation. Here's a certificate. And they can kind of brand their farm that way, and removing financial barriers. I think that's the biggest issue right now, is it's too costly. And so how do we remedy that? And more long-term, we can look at, this is kind of a little more controversial, but I think it's something interesting to keep an eye on, is biotechnology innovations. It's actually modifying the plants to enhance the root growth, but also resistance to heat and drought. So it requires less water, and they have built-in genetics that can withstand these kind of conditions. And so farming is ultimately improved by that. And so that kind of concludes this presentation. This is kind of a brief overview of how we take back the future through sustainable agriculture, particularly reducing water consumption in Arizona. Thank you.